right, problem. We got a potential problem here in Esther chapter 2, and it's one of the 3 or 4 problems that people who are critical of the historical setting or the reliability of the book of Esther will often point to say, hey, it's a good book and all, but it has some historical issues here and there. This is one of the real big ones in Esther chapter 2, and it has to do with the genealogy of Mordecai, one of the 2 heroes of the story, and particularly it has to do with his age and whether or not we are to believe, based on the way Esther is written, that he was like 110 years old or something when all of this is going down. So let me just read it to you and see if you catch the problem here. Esther 2, verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Well, you caught it, right? If that phrase, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, is referring to Mordecai, well, that means Mordecai was at least born by 586 BC. Maybe he was even a little bit older if we are to understand it this way. And that doesn't square at all with the timeline of events that we're looking at here over a century later in roughly 479 BC. That's probably about where we're at right now. And I want to be fair to this criticism. I want to be fair to the people who hold this position, because there are people who think that Esther is inspired and that it should definitely be in the Bible and that it's a very important story that reveals true things about God, but that it is a work of historical fiction of some sort. And even that makes it sound like I'm really getting after their position. I think people from this point of view would say that Esther is a story, and maybe it's the only straight-up story that is told as a tale that communicates a true essence of what needed to be communicated to make the point to the original audience in a way they would understand, but the genre is a lightly fictional historical drama. Now, that is not my first opinion. I think that after digging into this a lot in the past several months, I'm more persuaded than ever that this seems to be set in an actual historical setting and that the original audience most likely would have intuitively read this as being just a description of stuff that happens and a filling in of the gaps of some of the story they had heard and some of the story that they had not heard before. But I don't want to give the impression here that I'm just automatically the arch enemy of someone who reads this as being a different genre than how I read it. I think there are people who love the Bible and love God and love history and love truth who just look at the data and come to a little different conclusion here. And overwhelmingly, we're going to read and handle and glean from the book of Esther pretty much the same stuff. We just have a different read on how precisely historical this is intended to be understood as being. But now to the merits of the claim. If we are indeed to read this text as though it is telling us that Mordecai was taken into captivity in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, I think the story has problems. That doesn't add up to me. The actions and the attitudes and the vigorousness with which Mordecai tackles the situation, it just doesn't look like something that somebody in their 110s, 120s, or 130s would probably be doing. And we don't have wiggle room here in terms of the extra biblical timeline. We're within a year or two on the most vague parts of this particular extra biblical timeline, and we are, day of in terms of precision on other parts of this timeline. 586, give or take a year, is definitely when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity started. 539 is when Cyrus defeated Babylon. 538 is when he let the Jews go home. We know that it was in the 520s that the shenanigans with Cambyses and Bardius and Darius happens. We know how long Darius reigns. We know what year, like what time of year even Darius died. And when Xerxes took over, we know when the war council to plan the Greek invasion, we know when that happened. We know exactly when the Greek invasion happened, blow by blow. We even know the days of the month when the big battles, the big events of that invasion happened. And we know that now we're probably about a year out from that. We're in probably roughly 479 BC. So my point is, given all of that precision, it's just fruitless to go and look at the extra biblical timeline and be like, well, maybe if you look at it like this, maybe Nebuchadnezzar was actually there here. And no, there's no wiggle room there whatsoever. Those dates are really set in stone, which means if we want to further investigate the tension, we got to look at the phraseology of the text. What is it actually saying? Well, I think it's saying one of two things. It's either saying that Mordecai was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar 107 years before the events being described in Esther chapter 2, or it's saying that Kish, who would be his great-grandfather, is the one who was carried into exile from Jerusalem. Now, I'm reading from the 1984 edition of the New International Version. I also read from the English Standard Version sometimes, the New Living Translation sometimes, maybe some other stuff from time to time. I'm not slavishly loyal to any translation, but on this point, this version of the Bible doesn't really make this look like much of an issue, right? It's pretty easy. There's an aside being employed here. Remember those asides? They go in parentheses in the middle of a thought, or inside of a pair of commas in the middle of a thought, to be like, here's an extra thing. Like, I went to the swimming pool in 5th grade with my sister, aside, who is a great swimmer and a wonderful girl, and who has continued to be a great sister to me into adulthood, close aside. And we had a really funny thing happen that day at the swimming pool, right? I mean, we all know this. We understand this grammatically, right? Well, in the NIV, it looks like what we're getting here is just simply an aside where we learn that there was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. Now the aside starts, who was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who got carried away from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, the king of Judah. Close aside. Back to Mordecai. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, right? I mean, that's just how it sounds in my translation. But I did go and dig through this in a bunch of different translations, some that I actively use, some that I don't. And it's not as obvious in all of them. And so I went and dug into a work on the book of Esther by a couple of scholars who I really respect, who I think are very fair-minded. And both of them acknowledged that in the original language, this is a little bit clumsy. And it's possible even they both thought that the more natural read would be still to read this as an aside, but as an aside that closes after the name Kish. In which case we would read it as, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, aside, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, close aside, who had been carried into exile. In other words, the who had been carried into exile would reflect on Mordecai instead of reflecting on Kish. Here's the deal. I went to school for this, and yeah, there were classes and stuff, and I tried really hard, and I think my grades were okay in this kind of business, but I simply lack the knowledge or talent in Hebrew, in the original language here, for me to speak definitively to it. And from time to time, I just got to admit that crap. So I am reading people who I respect who say, look, it obviously has to be referring to Kish, but grammatically speaking, that isn't as smoking gun obvious in the original language and the manuscript data that we have as one might hope. And then I've read some other people who I'm maybe not quite as familiar with, but who are clearly much better at this than I am, who would say, no, it really does look like it's referring to Mordecai. And so I'm going to declare, I don't know, I'm not qualified to know on this, but I can present to you a range of opinions that people have. What I can say is this: everything about the book of Esther looks to me like it was written not long after the events that it describes. Like this would still be within living memory for certain. I mean, nothing about this looks like it was written, say, a century plus later in the age of Alexander. I mean, Persia is still where we are. Xerxes is still a character, a figure who the original audience would be familiar with. These cultural nuances and finer details of how the Persian court worked during the age of Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes. All throughout the book of Esther, it's assumed that the original audience would still have a little bit of a sense of that. And indeed, all of the other extra biblical logical evidence that continues to come in as time passes by supports the idea that Esther was written in relative proximity to the events it describes, and the somewhat fashionable position that was held in the late 1800s and into some of the 1900s that Esther was a product of a much, much, much later time, getting much closer to the time of Jesus. That hasn't aged particularly well. I think it's a pretty old book that clocks in pretty close in its original form to the events it describes. And if that was the case, everybody would have been so familiar with this calamity in a Jewish audience and so familiar with the timeline of that a gaffe of that size just would have discredited the whole thing so greatly that I don't think it would have stood the test of time the way it has. So at this point, I'm landing in a place where I think the whole story about being carried away into captivity is descriptive of Kish, and that over the successive generations, decisions have been made on the part of Mordecai's ancestors to remain first in Babylon, and then once the handoff over to Persia happened, to remain in Persia. And remember yesterday we talked about Susa and it's being a cultural center of gravity where Mordecai seemed to feel very at home and know his way around. Well, if Mordecai was somebody who remembered the first temple before it was destroyed, or remembered what it was like to be in Jerusalem, I think he would have gone back. I think instead what we're seeing here is almost an explanation on the part of the author of Esther as to why Mordecai is still there and why we should be sympathetic to him. Because, come on, 4 generations have passed since that calamity of 586 when Nebuchadnezzar came, and he's in Susa. Come on, original audience. It's Susa. And I think we understand why a lot of the Jews who were there, guys, would remain in Susa, near to that center of power. And as the story goes on, you will further see that Mordecai is vindicated in his decision not to go back and rebuild, but instead to stay put, because we needed some heroes like this to stay put, squarely planted in Persia, to stick up for their brethren and their sisterin who went back to Jerusalem and rebuilt. So with all of that said, and appreciating that some hyper-intelligent people read this differently, and accepting that there are people who are way better at the original language than I've ever been or ever will be, that they look at it and they see it differently than my conclusions here, I still find myself persuaded by the crowd who would say that Mordecai's great-grandfather Kish is the one who was taken into exile, and that Mordecai is a middle-aged-ish man at the point that these events are unfolding in the book of Esther, chapter 2. Wherever you land on that, grace and peace to all of you. I appreciate you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.